Keri felt the sweat trickling down her back as she stepped off the tour bus. The air was thick with the heat of summer, pressing against her skin like an unwanted embrace. The group had been trudging through the historical sites of Poland for days, and her patience was wearing thin. Her new husband, Alan, was absorbed in the itinerary, his eyes flicking over the map, oblivious to her discomfort. "Come on, Keri," Alan urged, his voice a mix of impatience and condescension. "We've got the whole day planned out. There's no time to waste." Keri nodded absently, her mind already wandering. She had agreed to this trip as part of their honeymoon, hoping it would bring them closer together. But instead, it felt like a trap. Every moment was scheduled, every step monitored. Alan's need for control was suffocating, leaving little room for spontaneity or joy. She longed for a moment to herself, away from the constant scrutiny. As the group set off down the narrow cobblestone streets of a small village, Keri lingered at the back. The village was quaint, its buildings old and worn, but there was something more that caught her eye. A dusty track leading away from the main road, winding its way toward the distant hills. She hesitated, glancing at Alan, who was already engrossed in a conversation with the guide about some obscure historical detail. Keri made a decision. She stepped off the path and onto the dusty track, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She had no idea where it led, but the thought of being alone, even for a little while, was too tempting to resist. She quickened her pace, putting distance between herself and the group, until their voices faded into the background. The track was rough, the earth dry and cracked beneath her feet. Wildflowers sprouted haphazardly along the sides, their bright colors a stark contrast to the dull browns of the dirt and stone. The farther she walked, the more she felt the tension in her body ease. The oppressive heat seemed to lift, replaced by a cool breeze that whispered through the tall grass. As Keri continued along the path, she noticed a structure rising in the distance. A stone tower, tall and solitary, perched on a hill. It stood out against the clear blue sky, its gray walls weathered by time. Something about it drew her in, an inexplicable pull that she couldn't resist. She reached the base of the hill, pausing to catch her breath. The tower loomed above her, silent and imposing. The track ended here, and there was no obvious way to reach the entrance. But Keri was determined. She began to climb, her hands grasping at tufts of grass and jagged rocks as she made her way up the slope. Finally, she reached the top. The tower's entrance was a simple wooden door, slightly ajar as if inviting her in. She hesitated, a small voice in the back of her mind warning her to turn back, but she pushed it aside. This was her chance to break free, to escape the confines of her life, even if only for a little while. Keri pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was cool and damp, a welcome relief from the heat outside. The interior was dimly lit, the only light coming from small slits in the stone walls that served as windows. In the center of the room was a spiral staircase, its steps worn and uneven. She felt a shiver of anticipation as she placed her foot on the first step. There was something both exhilarating and terrifying about the idea of climbing the tower, of not knowing what she would find at the top. She began to ascend, counting each step as she went, the numbers a steady rhythm in her mind. 1, 2, 3. The walls of the tower seemed to close in around her as she climbed, the space becoming narrower and narrower with each step. The air grew colder, and the light from the windows dimmed until she was surrounded by darkness. Her breath echoed in the silence, the sound of her heartbeat loud in her ears. 20, 21, 22. Keri felt a sense of unease creeping in, but she pushed it aside. She had come this far. She couldn't turn back now. The staircase twisted and turned, disorienting her, but she kept climbing, the numbers in her head her only anchor. 35, 36, 37. The walls were so close now that she could barely move without brushing against them. The air was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe. She felt as if she were being swallowed by the tower, the stone pressing in on her from all sides. 48, 49, 50. Keri stopped, her hand resting on the cold stone wall. She was exhausted, her legs trembling with the effort of the climb. The fear she had been trying to ignore was now impossible to deny. There was something wrong with this place, something unnatural. She had to get out, but the way back was just as uncertain as the way forward. She took a deep breath and continued, each step more difficult than the last. The walls were so close now that she had to turn sideways to squeeze through, the rough stones scraping against her skin. 65, 66, 67. The numbers in her head began to blur, her thoughts jumbled and confused. The staircase seemed to go on forever, an endless loop that twisted and turned in on itself. She was lost, trapped in a labyrinth of stone and darkness. 80, 81, 82. Keri stumbled, her foot catching on a loose stone. She fell to her knees, gasping for breath, her hands clawing at the walls for support. The air was thick with a sense of dread, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her, making it difficult to think, to move, to breathe. 90, 91, 92. She was on the verge of panic now, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't go on, but she couldn't stay here either. The walls were so close that she could feel them pressing against her from all sides, squeezing the breath from her lungs. 99, 100. Keri screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the tower. She was trapped, suffocating, the darkness closing in on her. She clawed at the walls, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. No escape, no end to the nightmare. Then suddenly there was a light, a faint glimmer in the darkness. Keri forced herself to move, to crawl toward it, her hands scraping against the rough stone. The light grew brighter as she neared, until she could see the outline of a door, a way out. With the last of her strength, Keri pushed the door open and stumbled out into the daylight. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling with exhaustion. The sun was blinding, the heat oppressive, but she didn't care. She was free. But as she lay there, her heart still racing, she realized that something was wrong. The landscape around her was unfamiliar, the hills and fields stretching out in all directions, with no sign of the village, the dusty track, or the tour group. The tower was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. Keri sat up, her mind reeling. Where was she? How had she gotten here? She looked around, searching for any clue, but there was nothing. She was alone, lost in a strange and unfamiliar place. Panic set in, the fear she had felt in the tower returning with full force. She got to her feet, her legs unsteady, and began to walk, hoping to find some sign of civilization, of a way back. But the more she walked, the more disoriented she became. The landscape seemed to shift and change around her, the hills blending into one another, the fields stretching out endlessly. Keri's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic jumble. Was this real? Had she imagined the tower, the staircase, the climb? Was she still trapped in the tower, her mind playing tricks on her? She didn't know, couldn't be sure of anything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, Keri felt a sense of hopelessness wash over her. She was lost, truly lost, with no way out. The fear that had been building inside her since she entered the tower now consumed her, a suffocating weight that pressed down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face. She had wanted freedom, but this was something else entirely. She was alone, trapped in a nightmare with no escape. As the darkness closed in around her, Keri curled up on the ground, her body trembling with fear. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the terror, but it was impossible. The walls of the tower were gone, but the fear remained, a suffocating presence that wrapped itself around her, squeezing the life out of her. And in the darkness, Keri realized that she had made a terrible mistake. The tower was not just a place, it was a state of mind, a prison of her own making. And now she was trapped in it forever, lost in the spiral of her own fears, with no way out. The night grew colder, the air thick with the scent of earth and decay. Keri's breath came in shallow gasps, her body shivering uncontrollably. The weight of the tower pressed down on her, even though it was no longer there. The walls might have vanished, but their presence lingered, invisible but suffocating. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Keri lay there, staring into the darkness, her mind teetering on the edge of sanity. She tried to remember Alan, the tour, the life she had left behind. But those memories were fading, slipping away like water through her fingers. In their place, new thoughts emerged, foreign and terrifying. What if she had never left the tower? What if this was just another level of the spiral, an illusion meant to break her spirit? The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. The tower was not just a physical structure, it was alive, feeding on her fear, warping reality to keep her trapped. Keri pushed herself up, her limbs heavy with exhaustion. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let the tower win. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out, even if it meant walking until she collapsed. With a renewed sense of determination, she set off into the night, the cold air biting at her skin. The landscape around her was a maze of shadows and shapes, distorted by the darkness. Every step felt like a struggle, the ground shifting beneath her feet as if the earth itself were conspiring against her. But she didn't stop, didn't let the fear take hold. She couldn't afford to, not now. As she walked, a strange sound reached her ears, a faint whisper carried on the wind. She froze, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. She shook her head, telling herself it was just her imagination, but deep down, she knew better. The tower was still with her, its presence lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. Keri quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came again, closer this time, a low murmur that sent chills down her spine. She spun around, searching the darkness for the source, but there was nothing, only the empty night. She turned back and kept walking, her steps unsteady, the fear gnawing at her resolve. The sound grew louder, more distinct, a voice whispering her name, calling her back. She clamped her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voice was inside her head, a persistent, insidious presence that she couldn't escape. "Keri! Keri!" It was Alan's voice, soft and coaxing, the same tone he used when he wanted her to do something she didn't want to do. She shook her head, trying to push it away, but the voice only grew louder, more insistent. "Keri, come back to me. You don't have to be afraid." "No!" she screamed, her voice echoing in the empty night. "I won't go back. I won't." The voice faltered, then faded, leaving her alone with the sound of her own ragged breathing. Keri collapsed to the ground, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She had won, had fought off the tower's hold on her mind. But at what cost? As she lay there, the cold seeping into her bones, a sense of despair washed over her. She was free from the tower, but she was still trapped, lost in a place she didn't understand, with no way out. The thought of spending the rest of her life wandering this endless, shifting landscape was unbearable. But there was no other choice. She had to keep going, had to find a way out, even if it meant walking until she collapsed. With a groan, she pushed herself to her feet, her limbs protesting with every movement. The night was still and silent, the darkness pressing in around her like a shroud. Keri began to walk again, her steps slow and unsteady. The landscape seemed to stretch out endlessly before her, a never-ending expanse of hills and fields. But she didn't stop, didn't let the fear take hold. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out, because if she didn't, the tower would find her again, and this time, there would be no escape. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time had lost all meaning. The darkness began to lift, the first faint light of dawn appearing on the horizon. Keri kept walking, her body numb with exhaustion, her mind teetering on the edge of madness. As the light grew stronger, she saw something in the distance, a shape rising from the earth like a specter. Her heart leaped in her chest, a flicker of hope sparking to life. She quickened her pace, the fear momentarily forgotten. But as she drew closer, the hope turned to horror. It was the tower, the same stone tower she had climbed before, standing tall and imposing against the morning sky. Keri stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. It couldn't be. She had escaped, had left the tower behind. But there it was, solid and real, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Panic seized her, and she turned to run, but her legs gave out beneath her, sending her crashing to the ground. She tried to crawl away, her hands scrabbling at the earth, but it was no use. The tower loomed above her, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. The door creaked open, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. Keri's heart pounded in her chest, a wild, frantic beat that matched the terror coursing through her veins. She couldn't go back, couldn't face the darkness again. But there was no escape. As the darkness closed in around her, Keri realized that she had been wrong. The tower wasn't a place, wasn't even a state of mind. It was her fate, her destiny, and there was no running from it. The tower had claimed her, and she would never be free. Thank you for listening. We hope you've enjoyed the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell button, and we'll notify you when the next story comes out.